Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today, Greg Egan, an Australian science fiction writer, in fact hard science fiction writer. Now, Greg Egan is pretty famous in the field of science fiction. He's probably not the most widely read, but he is a very interesting example of what science fiction can be. It is one of the ways that science fiction can be. And today we want to take the example of one of his novels, Quarantine, it is called, but he wrote, in fact, many more novels than this, and many short fiction as well. Greg Egan is kind of famously reclusive in the sense of he doesn't seek publicity. In fact, he actively rejects, I think, publicity. He famously boasts on his website that there's no picture of him online. Nevertheless, he is well known through his writing, quite simply. He's been accumulating words for at least a good 30 years by now, even a little bit more. What has he written of note that we will refer to as well in this video quickly? Well, Quarantine is a 1992 novel, quite an old one, of course. Diaspora, a 1997 one. I'll be referring to Terranesia as well, a 1999 novel. Scale, that came out in 2023, very interesting one, a sort of departure perhaps, or not, that's again the question. Zandegi, if I'm mispronouncing it, apologies, from 2010. And the trilogy, the orthogonal trilogy that started in 2011. In terms of short stories, there's quite a lot of production there again from Greg Egan, and many collections and volumes, some in print and some exclusively online. Personally, I'll be referring very briefly to two of them that I really love, Axiomatic from 1995 and Luminous from 1998. Oceanic came out in 2009. That's also an excellent collection, very representative of what Greg Egan can do. Now, you will say, okay, Greg Egan is a hard science fiction writer. What does that mean exactly? Hard to read, hard to decipher? What does that mean? Well, this is perhaps not the exact place to introduce the whole field of science fiction, of course. But you should know that science fiction is not one monolithic object. Science fiction has very different types of itself. So within the set of all books in science fiction, there are in fact dozens of possible ways of handling or writing within the field of science fiction. Hard science fiction refers quite simply to those writers, a minority, really a minority in science fiction. Hard science fiction refers to those writers who put a lot of effort in being scientifically exact. Now, you will say, well, science fiction, I thought it was all about science. Well, no, typically really it isn't. First of all, because there are many books of science fiction without any science in them at all, or in a sort of nod to type of Frederick Brown in the 50s, or the Americans before that, really, the originators of it. Well, you simply, assume that there is a way to go from Earth to Mars in one day, and you don't really bother to explain it, the point not being the science of it, the point being the story that you're trying to develop and perhaps the themes that you're trying to introduce. In other words, it is extremely common in science fiction to have very little science, or no science at all, or a science which is never the point of the novel. Now, hard science, or hard science fiction, in fact, makes science one of the points of the novel. And that is important to understand because it means that those novels of hard science fiction dedicate a lot of themselves to putting down the basics of whichever world they are building and explaining how those worlds work, whatever kind of science they have developed in those worlds work. And of course, making sure that it sticks, that is, that it is scientifically viable. It doesn't mean, of course, that it is possible now, nor does it mean that it will exist within a few decades, perhaps even hundreds of years, but scientifically it is viable, that is, that it is eventually possible, plausible. And that is one of the ways that science fiction was defined in opposition to fantasy. So fantasy, you know, probably books like Lord of the Rings is not science fiction, it is called fantasy. Fantasy sells a lot more than science fiction. And one of the differences, or the essential difference perhaps between science fiction and fantasy, is that in fantasy you have things that are impossible, flying carpet or wizards, mind reading type of stuff. Whereas in science fiction you have what is perhaps not possible now, but plausible. It could happen later. Interstellar voyages could happen. There is nothing against them. There are many things against them, but scientifically it is possible to imagine that they could, in fact, happen. Being visited by aliens is also a possibility. It might look very remote right now, but of course we've only been aware of our surroundings for, 2,000 years, so it is still very recent. In other words, aliens could one day perhaps come. They might not, they might never do so, there might not be aliens in the world, in the universe, but they might be. So the plausibility as opposed to the impossibility is what separates science fiction from fantasy. One of the things. And Greg Egan is firmly in the school of the science that he uses or introduces, the stories that he develops on the basis of a scientific idea, those scientific ideas, that science, that's got to be right. It's got to be plausible. Plausible not only scientifically, but in the sense of perhaps later, in 100, in 1,000, in 10,000 years, who knows what will happen, it could happen. And that is hard science fiction. Now, as I said, hard science fiction is in a minority when it comes to science fiction publications, quite simply because one aspect of them, of course, which makes them a little red in that sense, is how, arduous, difficult sometimes the science can be. And Greg Egan is an extreme example of that. We have, of course, historically works like the practice effect from David Brin. David Brin was a very, very big name in the 80s, 90s science fiction. He wrote an excellent trilogy based on the idea of cognitive development induced by us of animals like dolphins and chimpanzees, the Uplift trilogy. But the book I'm referring to is an old book from the 80s, the end of the 80s, I think, and it's called The Practice Effect, which is quite simply, it takes as its departure point the expression, practice makes perfect, and David Brin, who was a scientist himself, still is a scientist, he's not dead. David Brin quite simply tried to affix a scientific principle behind that proverb that practice makes perfect. And so the guy arrives on a planet where practice indeed makes perfect, but David Brin has a whole lot of scientific arguments to underpin this idea, and then the story develops from there, of course. So David Brin is like Larry Niven in the 80s, people who cared a lot about Stephen Baxter as well, now and again. People who do care about the scientific exactitude, the rightness of their scientific approaches behind the novels that they're writing. Of course, you all know one of the main exponents, I guess, of hard science fiction is Arthur C. Clarke of 2001 Space Odyssey fame. If you don't know him, he's also a very big name in science fiction, started writing in the 50s, I think, and he was a scientist himself, of course, heavily involved in the setting up of satellites around the planet, around Earth, to enable communication, global communication. And already, of course, he was trying to infuse his text with real science. Not fake science, real science. Ursula Le Guin, a wonderful, wonderful science fiction writer, is not in that school, to give you an example or a counterexample. And, of course, she hypothesized a means of communicating instantaneously between one corner of the other, the Ansible, she called it. It caught up. Many writers have then reused that concept, but for Ursula Le Guin, how such an Ansible, such a means of communicating across light years would work was absolutely not her concern. What she was interested in, of course, was the fact that what happens if you can communicate from one corner of the galaxy to the other instantaneously as opposed to not. And so, again, a great difference between people like her, the majority in science fiction, and people like Greg Egan. Now, Greg Egan is very interesting and has really made a name for himself for the, some would call it, I guess, extreme exactitude of his scientific approach and the great pains he takes to describe and explain that science in his novels. Now, that is not always true. In fact, sometimes it doesn't really explain how things work, and it makes it, in fact, for somebody like me, for example, who has only a very thin veneer of knowledge in hard sciences like mathematics or physics, it makes it sometimes extremely difficult to follow, quite simply because the science is too difficult for me. And that is necessarily one aspect of hard science fiction that must put off a lot of people. And Greg Egan, I think it's fair to say, sometimes seems much more interested in the science of his ideas, in his thought experiments, than in what would typically constitute a readable novel for most of us: characterization, plot, developments. And sometimes, to be honest, one struggles to find themes that one can relate to when the focus seems to be exclusively on science. Now, that is necessarily, I think, a downside of hard science fiction novels. I think it is a downside that those authors accept because they understand that there is a trade-off here, and that extreme readability is one thing. You know, exactitude in ideas or in scientific approaches is sometimes something else. And if you are intent on describing and explaining how things could work, scientifically speaking, and again, plausible science, then of course it's going to come at the cost of some aspects of readability. It's very difficult to explain very complex scientific ideas in an extremely readable way, unfortunately, something that all academics know about. And that is certainly the case with Greg Egan. Now, what is very interesting with Quarantine, the novel from 1990, I can't remember now, 1992, the one that I want to take as an example, is Quarantine is one of those novels, earlier novels, I guess one could say, where Greg Egan was obviously interested in not losing sight of narratability, narrative pace, characterization. In other words, he was obviously intent on having both the science and readability coming together. Now, Quarantine is based on, I'm simplifying enormously, and my apologies, of course, but Quarantine is based basically on the idea of one of the ideas of quantum theory in physics, which is that the moment you observe an object, an electron, or whatever, you have an influence on its behavior. In other words, it is not possible to know one thing without observing it, and yet if you do observe it, it is not the same thing as it was before you observed it, the observer effect. Now that's well known, it's also well known across different sciences, like in ethnology, for example. It is a well-known problem that the moment you observe a practice or a ritual in the wild, the immediate question is, well, does it really happen when I'm not here to see it? That is, of course, do the natives practice their ritual that way when there is no external observer, outsider from the group? Now, in quantum theory, I'm sure you know this because it is, of course, the Schrödinger's cat paradox, which I remind you, if you don't know it, or if you do know it, it was intended by Schrödinger to disprove some aspects of quantum theory. It was not an example of, it was an example of how ridiculous, in fact, that theory seemed to him at the time. But that's by the by. Quarantine is firmly in the narrative sort of novel. That is, there are characters, there is a leading character, a very interesting voice in itself, in fact, very well informed, very scientific. And all sorts of things happen. So there are many events and there are many sort of mysteries and sudden revelations. And it is all articulated around the idea that by observing the universe, in fact, at a very large scale, the exact opposite of the quantum scale, but humans end up having an influence on what they observe. And here, I cannot tell you, of course, what is revealed towards the end of the novel, but it really accelerates and it has great consequences for, well, the universe as a whole. Now, Quarantine is an excellent example of hard science based firmly on well-known, well-proved aspects of science, in this case quantum theory, but it is also introduced through a very strong narrative, and there is really a great revelation at the end, and the novel goes way, way beyond its original starting point. Terranesia, another Greg Egan novel from 1999, is also very clearly an attempt by Greg Egan to bring together again the two poles of his writing, hard science and readability. It is about two younger people, and this one is much more based on biology and biological science, as it were. And here really there is an obvious desire from Greg Egan, obvious to me as a reader, of course, I haven't asked him, to infuse the novel with real human elements. Now, the science is still there, the science explains what happens and what would or will not happen, but ultimately the novel is firmly focused on those two characters and their own evolution. There is perhaps a parallel between the evolution of the place they're in and their evolution as characters, but very clearly here that matters to Greg Egan. Now, obviously, I'm saying this because there are other novels where characterization is very thin, I find. It's very, very difficult to feel for the characters because they are not really characters. Now, the orthogonal trilogy, I think, is a great example. Also, it's a great example to me, again, as a humble reader, of perhaps a missed opportunity or a desire from Greg Egan to simply do his stuff, and nobody should have anything to say about his choices, of course. You can always drop the novel if you don't like it. But the orthogonal trilogy starts off with, it's a simple sort of premise in science fiction, it's a voyage of exploration for different reasons, and it's not really us as people. It has evolved, let's say, in a slightly different direction. And so Greg Egan puts a whole sort of social or society in place, and that society and its sort of rules and its vision on the world is completely informed and argued, I would say, through the scientific premise of the book itself. Now, that's great because that proves that you can world build in many different directions and you can ensure that you have the good science down pat and work out not only scientific things but sociological things. Not only, for example, how would such a society work in such a context, but also how would it think about itself and how would it view things as normal to us, as it were, as life, death, reproduction, and the like. The problem to me in that trilogy is that, first of all, the science is really difficult, very, very difficult, and there is a point at which Greg Egan can only sort of, use jargon that one doesn't know. And it is obvious that he has such a large background reading. Greg Egan qualified as a mathematician originally. He has such a large background reading and understanding of those things that it becomes very, very difficult to translate them in ways that make sense to us, the readers. So unless you go and read scientific articles or have a glossary with you explaining what each term is, and in physics or in math, of course, that can be extremely difficult, there are things that are simply, to me, who again doesn't have a background. I don't have a background in math or physics. I'm certainly not at that level, just school level. Makes it impossible to follow. Now, the sociological developments are interesting in themselves, but it's a thought experiment based on a thought experiment from the science. What we, I think, don't really get in your orthogonal trilogy is the human aspect. And fair enough, you would say, because they're human without really being human, but I don't think that it necessarily negates the possibility of infusing those characters with some real sort of life to them. And I think that in that sense, this trilogy resembles some other books, more recent books by Greg Egan, where the focus is so intensely on the physics or the math and what derives from them that I simply completely lose interest in the characters or in the story itself. Now, of course, that is a possible shortcoming of any hard science fiction. You need to enjoy the scientific explorations, the thought experiments with a scientific basis. But sometimes a writer will put that up, and then based on that, will simply go on to do something else. And you may have a perfectly valid scientific explanation for a certain type of world, but the book is not about that. Again, the book is what would happen if. Thought experiment, classic, of course, science fiction benefit, one of the benefits that science fiction gives us. And sometimes, as is the case with Greg Egan, you can perhaps lose sight of the fact that there are readers out there, and that if you really wanted to explore the thought experiment, perhaps you could publish scientific articles, but not necessarily need to, construct a story or a narrative which is kind of walking on one leg, because very obviously the focus is on science, not on readability. Now, finally, of course, you would say, well, I'm not really into science. I don't need to know equations to follow characters. So why would I read hard SF, hard science fiction? Well, Greg Egan, again, is a wonderful, wonderful exponent of hard SF that deserves to be read. Again, making sure that you understand that some of his books are much, much more difficult than others. But I list a few that I think are very accessible in that sense. And when you get to those passages where science becomes too difficult, just skip if you don't like them. And if you really care about the story, then there is a story to hang on to. But what hard science fiction enables a writer to do, and what really, frankly, any science fiction well done enables any writer to do, is to speculate. Many writers of science fiction have complained about the name because we well understand, and typically for most people science fiction means aliens, spaceships, lasers, whatever, Star Trek, Star Wars type of things. Whereas again, this is really a minority in science fiction. There are so-called space operas, for example, that would resemble very much Star Wars. They are, of course, tropes like exploration of the universe, as in Star Trek, all those things. But these books, again, are a minority in the production of science fiction, just like hard science fiction is a minority. There are many different strands in science fiction, many different so-called tropes, ideas, recurring ideas that inform science fiction. And hard science, like any of them, enables somebody to speculate. So those complaining about the name science fiction have clamored for using the term speculative fiction. What is speculation? Speculation is having thought experiments and working out the consequences of those thought experiments. And that is, of course, what people like Greg Egan are wonderful at, is having ideas, having a thought experiment that really has great consequences in all types of areas of life. It can be the way we see ourselves, the way we think about ourselves, the way we organize ourselves, what we do, what we did, what we will become, what we could become. All questions, existential questions, of course, that science fiction is great at, simply because it speculates. What if? What if this? Perhaps a strange source for a science fiction video, but Kingsley Amis, the father of the famous and wonderful Martin Amis, speculated, it's called alternative history in science fiction, speculated that the Protestant Revolution hadn't taken place in Europe, of course, at the end of the Middle Ages, and that Europe had remained Catholic. In fact, America was completely Catholic because there had been no Reformation, that is, no Protestant church rising. Okay, so does it need to be explained this? Well, no, this is just a situation. And then Kingsley Amis, like many other people have done, of course, in alternative history, simply works out the consequences. What would the world be like if Catholicism had never been challenged, rivaled, or toppled, of course, replaced in some situation? What would the world look like? How would people think? What would be the place, for example, of technology in a world ruled exclusively by the Catholic Church, as it was in the 15th, 16th century, as you remember? Pretty, hard-going church in terms of keeping science quiet. And this is, of course, what science fiction enables you to do, and this is what hard science enables you to do on the basis of existing principles, existing science, and then you speculate, you simply push it. What if this became that? And that is why, of course, artificial intelligence, AI, that everybody's talking about today in 2025, was speculated on long time ago by science fiction writers who, right from, I guess, the sort of Alan Turing era, the 40s, 50s, of course, started speculating about artificial intelligences and what would the world be like, what would happen if we had them, what would happen if we had them and they suddenly stopped, what would happen. I don't need to remind you of Terminator. Terminator from the 80s, the movie, is science fiction. It's a movie, but it's science fiction, and it is, of course, based on the idea that AI going rogue. All those ideas were speculated on by people who had an interest both in science and in ideas. And that is, of course, one of the great benefits of science fiction in general, and certainly of people like Greg Egan. So if you are interested in science, if you like to think about how things work, but how things could work, or what we know now, where could that lead? How could it become something else? And on the basis of that solid science, develop ideas about us as people. Greg Egan is somebody that you will certainly like, starting again with novels like Quarantine or Terranesia, or certainly starting with some short stories, Axiomatic again, or Luminous. Two wonderful collections where Greg Egan asked, for example, he considers homosexuality in a possible world based on biological development. He considers memory, the role of memory and identity. All those things are perfectly possible while keeping the science on the straight and narrow and being exact and true and working out the consequences of scientific advancement. He is, of course, only one of many, but there is a reason why he is quite famous in the circle of science fiction and hard science fiction specifically, and that is that he manages, in most of his books, I think, to keep together both the science and the readability. If you want to start small, you can start with a very tiny novel, really, that he published two years ago. Scales, it's called. Scale or Scales? I'm sorry, I can't remember. Put it up somewhere. Terrific little novel, wonderful premise, great idea to start off with. It's not difficult to follow. There's a real sort of mystery. So this time it's really sort of plot driven, you could say. But the consequences of the science and the world in which we are kept throughout and do have an influence on the mystery, on the narration, on the characters. Scales is perhaps even more than Quarantine or Terranesia a great place to start with Greg Egan's work and production. And the more you read him, perhaps the more you like him, and the more you like him, the more you can go to the more extreme science-infused novels. Greg Egan, highly recommended. Go and have a look. You might love it. You might find it very difficult, but you will certainly not be left indifferent by this type of science fiction. Thank you.